Coming up on ReFramed. Today we'll be discussing a Netflix series called The Witcher.
The issue of having non-disabled actors effectively mimicking the physical characteristics and impairments of disabled people.
She was having like a sexual relationship with someone, and I was like, oh, cool, we're like showing sexuality and disability. This is something that doesn't happen quite a lot.
You know, it was a bit unexpected because I wasn't really, prepared to be a stage mum.
Welcome back to ReFramed, the podcast that reframes how disability is portrayed in film and TV. I'm your host, Jason Climo, and today I have Stephanie Dower with me as my lovely co-host, along with this week's special guest, who is Catia Malaquias. Today we'll be discussing a Netflix series called The Witcher. I'm sure many of you have heard about it, but before we get stuck into that one, let's say hello to Catia and learn a little bit more about them. So welcome to the podcast, Catia. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Jason and Stephanie. It's lovely to be here, starting the new year, thinking about disability representation in fiction, so on TV. So I'm looking forward to getting underway and talking about some of these sort of interesting things.
Me too. It's going to be very exciting, and The Witcher is a very good one. You chose that, so thank you. And actually raised to me that there was actually disability representation that we need to unpack in that. I just watched it, and for some reason it just washed over the top of my head. Can you believe it? But anyway, let's start off with just you telling everyone a bit about yourself so they can learn a bit about you.
So I'm a lawyer, and I also sit on a number of not-for-profit organisation boards, and all in relation to disability and the rights of people with disability. And I'm also the mum of 3 young kids, or they're getting a bit big now, so I don't know if I can actually just make that statement unqualified, but I have a 13-year-old, Laura, a 12-year-old Julius, who has Down syndrome, and 10-year-old Drea. And I am really passionate about human rights and inclusion of people with disability, and in all areas, really, in all aspects. But I guess my particular focus has been in relation to media and cultural representation, as well as in education. Having school-aged children, the latter is a reality every day for us. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I was really excited to be able to chat to you today because I've been a follower of your organization, starting with Julius, for the last few years. You guys do amazing work, and I think hearing your son's name, I now know the background to where that came from. Tell us a bit more about your work with that organization.
Yeah, so look, starting with Julius really started out sort of very unplanned in a sense. Julius was pretty young at the time, and I was actually, sitting at home watching a lot of Sesame Street when he was a baby, and my daughter, his older sister, was about 3 years old, and I started to see disability representation on Sesame Street, and I guess that got me thinking about why we're not seeing it done well, in particular, authentically in other media, and just thinking about the importance of that, of authentic and positive disability representation. So it's something that sort of started to, that thinking, I sort of started to think about that and to question that. And then one night I was, doing online shopping for my kids, and, my son Julius, who was, one of the customers effectively in those transactions, I thought, well, why, I'm buying clothes for Julius, why, don't I ever see, kids like him represented? And so I actually shot off an email to the brand that I was buying from, because they clearly in their advertising actually had a real commitment to diversity, and were going to, making effort to represent, children of different skin colors and ethnic backgrounds. And so I posed the question, where are the kids with disability, basically. That started discussion. Then at Julius's sort of first, modelling gig, which, was a bit unexpected because I wasn't really, prepared to be a stage mum. But, that created an opportunity to start to talk about that. And then from that, I wanted to do something a bit more formally, to have a bit more structure, and starting with Julius was born from that. And I really didn't know what I wanted to call that project or that effort or that idea, but a friend who's a journalist said, well, why don't you call it Starting with Julius? That's how it started, right?
Yeah.
And so, and from there, I guess, other people have been, involved, like Jason, and we've sort of had the opportunity to talk to companies and to encourage more disability representation in advertising. Still a very long way to go in all areas and in all types, but it started with Julius, and we're sort of trying to take it from there. So yeah, that's basically the backstory to it.
That.
And yeah.
And you've been able to achieve so many amazing things through it as well, which is very exciting. I feel like I started with Starting with Julius almost, to play on the words there, but you and Angel were like two of the first people that I connected with, I guess, in the inclusion world, I would call it, or disability inclusion world, because, it was one of the first times where I actually stopped to think about what representation actually means and inclusion means. So really, I feel like I tell Angel all the time that I owe probably the two of you so much in terms of where my career has gone and how I even perceive myself as a disabled person and all of that. So very grateful to the two of you, and also Starting with Julius. I wanted to just throw, I guess, the conversation a bit of a different angle, which is about your very particular passion about reforming the education system. So I didn't know if you wanted to just take a moment to really drive home that point, so all of our viewers following along can learn from you on that.
Look, as a non-disabled parent, one of the things that I became very aware, very early on, is that I brought, a lot of assumptions about disability, to my role, and I came to see fairly quickly that there were a lot of dangerous assumptions in our culture and how we think about disability. And in particular, when Julius was born, I was asking like nurses at the hospital, can you recommend, special schools? Julius has Down syndrome, he has an intellectual disability. And without really thinking about that very much. But the other side of, the other angle is that, well, I'm a lawyer as well, so I kind of like, documents that explain things and talk about people's rights. I'm drawn to things like that. And I sort of, as I was reading more about it, I realized, well, there is a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities that actually, was drafted with people with disability. And it's the most authoritative statement on the human rights of people with disability, and it's there. So one of the things in that convention is the right to inclusive education, which is in Article 24. And, it became pretty apparent as soon as he sort of entered school that education systems don't really comply with Article 24, that in the sense that they permit different, models that actually contravene the right to inclusive education. And particularly for kids with intellectual disabilities like Julius, there's a very strong push to segregated models of education. So I became really passionate about this. It's really apparent to me. And, we talk about inclusion, and inclusion is really important, but inclusion is something that has to happen, in all areas of life. And it kind of starts with education.
And I guess it's that whole concept of, one of the most effective ways to create change is from the bottom up, really. So start from when they're young at school, and then...
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think what I'd add to that as well is that inclusive education is important because it's obviously a human right of kids with disabilities, but it's also important in terms of starting from the bottom up, because it's not about kids with disabilities learning to be part of society. It's actually also about society learning to support with and be inclusive.
Yeah.
There'd be a lot less stigma in the world if kids were taught respect and inclusion from the beginning. So yeah.
Perfect. I think just lastly, if you wanted to just rehash why you think, bring it back to the relevance of the podcast, why you think representation in mainstream media is so important, like the impact you believe it has.
Look, I guess media tells stories, I guess, about the human condition. It presents perspectives, and it is a real shaper of our cultural beliefs and ideas. And much of, a significant part, I suppose, of the experience of people with disability in society is linked to attitudes in some way or another, even in sort of society's failure to have an inclusive education system that also is connected to attitudes. So attitudes are both reflected in, but shaped by and reinforced by the media. And the media is sort of social media, but mainstream media, all kinds of media is how we communicate with each other as humans. So if disabled people are not represented, are omitted from media, that's a problem, particularly when we look at a history of exclusion and marginalisation, because that reinforces that idea that, special places for special people, that sort of thing. I use that in an inverted comma sense, the word special. Not a fan of that.
I think you said it really well before, actually, when you were talking about when you learned that your son had a disability and your mind went immediately to special schools. And that's because culture, the way that it depicts disability, is exclusionary and other. So I think that was a really great example of how important culture and representation can be to not people with disabilities on their own, but to our friends, our family, and the wider society, I think, yeah.
And then jump to now, I think you are the perfect kind of embodiment on this podcast to show anyone at home who's non-disabled following along, that's learning a lot from this podcast, that change and progress is very possible within a singular person and within society as well, because look where you've come from and look where you are now, I guess. So I guess anyone who's following along and it feels very overwhelming, it's just about, actually just being, I guess, open to change and open to being educated and led by people with disability to actually teach you and educate you along the way about what we're asking for in terms of representation, but also just in terms of everyday human rights and inclusion throughout society, rather than just on screen. I know we focus a lot about on-screen representation and inclusion, but the end goal is always really, it's not just about that. The end goal really is about the impact that has. So thank you for kind of taking us on that little journey there, Catia. All right, we're going to leave that there and we're going to jump straight into analysing our TV series for this week, which is The Witcher, which is currently available in Australia on Netflix. So Steph, did you want to give us a bit of an overview of The Witcher?
So The Witcher is a series that is currently airing on Netflix, or streaming, I should say, seasons 1 and 2. It's based on a book series of the same name, and it explores the legend of Geralt of Rivia. You're really testing me on the names, by the way. Geralt of Rivia, who is known as the Witcher, along with Princess Ciri and sorceress Yennefer, as they live out their destinies in a medieval-inspired land known as the Continent. And, I mean, where do we start, Jason?
Well, I guess the reason why we are actually, there's many reasons, but the reason why we're actually reviewing this is that obviously there's characters with disability throughout. And I guess the main one, if you've watched season 1, is Yennefer's storyline. So maybe we'll hand over to Catia as our special guest for today to really get the ball rolling on how you feel about the disability representation throughout The Witcher, but maybe specifically around Yennefer to start off with.
Oh, thank you, Jason. So I should start by saying that the genre of The Witcher is not something that I normally would gravitate towards. So I didn't watch Game of Thrones. I've watched bits of it, but not as a full, it's so long. There are so many episodes and so many series. But I was obviously very aware of Game of Thrones from a disability representation perspective. And because I suppose it's school holidays and, you know, it's been really hot in Perth as well, a friend was talking about The Witcher, and that, you know, he loved the series, was, you know, thought it was fantastic. And I sort of said, oh, isn't there, you know, like a sort of disability representation in that? Because I'd sort of heard something about it. And she was like, oh, I didn't realize. So again, she sort of watched it without thinking about it. So I was very curious. And so I decided to watch it. And it, you know, I have been sort of kind of, I guess, reflecting on this particular show and the disability representation in it, because it's highly problematic, but it's also, it has some interesting aspects as well, which I think are sort of worth talking about. So as Steph introduced, so Gerald is the main character, and he's a sort of a mutant monster slayer type person, you know, with sort of very dramatic kind of hairstyle, a bit like Fabio in the 1980s.
Literally, but like put it on
Literally.
Henry Cavill and it's hot though.
Yeah, exactly. Totally not why I was watching it, but so and Gerald himself is quite interesting as well from the perspective of disability representation, and I'll come to that. But the main character really that, you know, has caused, I suppose, some discussion is the character of Yennefer, the sort of sorceress. And Yennefer actually starts out the series as she's a sort of a young girl from the village, and her story is kind of told in parallel to Gerald, so they don't sort of meet until later. But she has a hunchback and some facial differences, and so we sort of see Yennefer being sort of mocked and mistreated and ostracized, and including by her father, who, you know, is sort of treats her very poorly, and ends up actually selling Yennefer to a powerful sorcerer called Tisea, who buys her for less than the cost of one of the pigs that her dad is selling, that sort of thing. And immediately when Yennefer appeared on screen, I had that feeling, you know, when you watch those movies and there's like the geeky girl and she's going to like transform into, you know, it just
the ugly
felt,
duckling storyline.
It felt very sort of fake in a sense, like it, you know, so you can tell that she's not, you know, really disabled. So she, I think, you know, the way that they obviously sort of tried to, you know, insert some prosthetics or something in her cheeks, but it just didn't feel authentic. So already I could sort of tell that there is some kind of transformation narrative involved here. But of course, you know, it kind of, you know, the first thing that, you know, popped into my mind was like, this is a non-disabled person playing the role of a disabled character. And so immediately I was like, you know, boo, exactly. Not a fan of how this is being done. And then, of course, actually the story kind of gets worse in a sense, because, you know, I mean, other than the general problem, which I'm sure you know, you may have discussed already in the podcast, but the issue of, you know, having non-disabled actors effectively mimicking the physical characteristics and impairments of disabled people is really not a good thing. I think in Yennefer's case, that the transformation itself of Yennefer from a disabled person to effectively a non-disabled person is highly problematic, because it involves the sort of the miracle cure narrative as well, which is very harmful. And, you know, as the parent of a child with a disability, I'm very conscious of problematic portrayals from that perspective of harm to, you know, self-perception and self-image. So I kind of immediately I thought, well, what does this actually say to, you know, disabled young women in particular? And I think Yennefer's character blends a couple of bad things. So there's blending of ableism as well as, you know, sexism effectively, or misogyny, and it, so there's a gender aspect to this. Again, the ugly duckling sort of trope, as well as the cure, you know, the revelation, but this cure of Yennefer's disability. And so, you know, from that perspective, you know, I found it really problematic. So, you know, Yennefer's kind of like got, you know, as the young girl before her transformation, she has, you know, kind of they dress her in sort of ill-fitting clothes, and she's got sort of like a bad hairstyle, and you know, and deliberately. And then, of course, you know, when she's transformed, not only does her body, you know, completely change, but her hair is glossy and shiny,
and she has
she's
like
perfectly made up,
incredible makeup and hair all of the time, and outfits.
So all of that, you know, so it felt, you know, really kind of inauthentic.
It's like they really dramatized the two versions of her almost as much as they possibly could. They were like, this is the before and this is the after. Like,
I think that's true. You know, disability is not something, it's not a bad hairstyle. It's not the wrong ill-fitting clothing. It's not something that needs to, it's not a choice. It's not something that needs to be changed in order to be beautiful. But that's what this ugly duckling sort of trope like feeds into the minds of viewers, doesn't it? So,
and I was so disappointed because like I was so hopeful during, I feel like, probably half an episode, because they showed Yennefer when she was, I guess, still disabled, which just feels odd to say. She was having like a sexual relationship with someone, and I was like, oh, cool, we're like showing sexuality and disability. This is something that doesn't happen quite a lot on, especially like a mainstream show like that. And then it was just like, lol jokes, she's not disabled anymore. And I was like, what are you doing to me?
that was the problematic part. The most problematic part for me was she literally gave up. You know, she was someone who was sexual. She was someone who was powerful. She actually had a lot going for her and her character, but she still decided to give all of that up in order to become aesthetically, visibly what is considered beautiful. And so it's basically saying disability is the, you know, you will do anything in order to not be physically disabled anymore.
It's like no matter who you are and what you can do, disability will always sit in the cons column. Like,
totally. And but that's what I also found interesting about the character, and I don't think that the creators of the show really gave disability any thought other than it being this plot device of the miracle transformation and part of that whole sort of narrative. But, you know, they did, and that's what I found so interesting, is that they did show, you know, so there was the sex scene before between Yennefer and Istrid, the other sorcerer, and he falls in love with her. And throughout the series, both first and second, because I've watched most of the second one, he's almost sort of like resentful of the fact that she, you know, sort of basically, you know, changed herself in that way. And, you know, there's a scene later on where he meets her, I think in the second series, and, you know, he says something to her, well, at least you kept your eyes, because she has these sort of violet colored eyes. But so she was, you know, she had this relationship where, you know, she, you know, and I'm not saying that, you know, that's what validates her as a human being, but she, you know, it was an unusual thing for, in terms of representation of disability, to have, you know, a sex scene that, you know, where, even though her body was like obviously, you know, mimicry, but it did show her and, you know, Istrid basically naked, you know, having sex, and that in itself actually sort of challenges that, you know, often the portrayal of disabled people is, you know, not being sexual.
Or romanticized, or
absolutely.
And then as I was sort of wanting to find out a bit more about The Witcher and disability representation, I actually then found there was, I don't know if you came across it, a discussion about Geralt himself. And in the books, Geralt being disabled.
Yes.
And so I think someone actually on Twitter had a thread discussing this, and the showrunner, Lauren Hisrich, I think her name is, sort of picked up on this and seemed quite enthusiastic about the idea of, oh, this is a layer, she called it a layer to Gerald. But again, I was sort of thinking, yeah, but are you just going to do your own non-disabled perspective on what Gerald's disability is, or are you going to, explore this in a different way? And then we're sort of, again, back to the same problem with, what's his name? Henry Cavill is not a disabled person.
Exactly.
I mean, what's worse, problematic representation or no representation? I don't know that there is a worse. They're both really bad because they both have their own harmful messages. But, so I don't know how to greet the sort of the news that they're really excited about, Gerald's sort of disability, and are planning to explore this in coming seasons.
I saw that too, and I loved how like the response was so excited that it was like, here you go, this is what we're going to give you. And I was like, so the best thing that we're going to get out of this series is that we're going to have a non-disabled man play a disabled character. He's going to acquire something that's probably going to like possibly make him seem like he's weaker. But there'll be like this whole like hero overcoming disability narrative most likely as well. But behind the scenes, the best thing that they can possibly ever do, so like the best case scenario that we'll get out of The Witcher with Gerald's character being disabled, is that they may possibly hire a person with disability to kind of consult behind the scenes, maybe, but I highly doubt it.
But also, like, when they started the series, that was in the books. They purposefully chose to remove that from his character. So they're just gonna add it in now? Like, I mean, look, if it's something that is exciting to them and it can layer the character and can add something more to it, great. But I don't know, to me, I'm like, you've kind of done your dash a bit for me.
And again, it's like it feels like they're using disability as like a
plot
tool.
device.
Yeah, a
really.
plot device,
Yeah.
literally.
I mean, just from my perspective, just seeing what I've seen of it, and I don't know what their thought process was behind like the writing of the series, but I just wonder if they even realized what they had on screen was dealing with disability. I wonder if that did actually cross their mind.
Because it's based on novels, and I feel like the novels probably in more detail, like you have a character who is like the main character is a person with disability, and then you have another main character who's a person with disability who then like erases their own, I guess, disability experience. And it's kind of like, whoa, this is like a very big kind of narrative that you guys are just skimming over in this.
But I also do wonder, I haven't read the original books,
Neither.
but I think some of the stuff that I was reading about Gerald was like, oh, they've erased his disability. But I'm sort of thinking, well, how is that portrayal in the book as well? Because I'm struggling to, I think the prospect that it's something that you might, I don't know, characterize as authentic representation. I think there's real little prospect, particularly when we know that Yennefer, I think that plot of her curing her own disability is part of that. So there has to be some fairly strong, inherently ableist, tropes in that. So again, I'm curious. I'm now sort of thinking, do I go and read The Witcher? It's curiosity is driving me. It's just because I'm sort of interested to see
how bad it is.
How bad it is, but also because these things, they're bad. They become huge. They go unchallenged. So that's why even today I thought, talking about The Witcher, I don't even generally watch this sort of genre, but I think it's a huge show. Look, I should say I think that having watched The Witcher, I do think that it should come with a content warning for disabled people. I think that, particularly, I have a son, but particularly if I, had a young, well, she probably, if she's a young daughter, young disabled daughter, wouldn't be watching The Witcher anyway. But even as a, young disabled women, I think that, it's just some of the narrative is so problematic, I think, in that sense, and that whole cure, that whole sort of contrast, that whole message is harmful.
Well, I think it might be time to give our scores out of 5 on the Inclusive Disability Representation Scale. So, Steph, did you want to kick us off?
Yes. Look, it probably didn't help that this show is not my vibe. It's not.
Yes, we forced Steph to watch this, by the way. The two of you, like, it's funny that we're reviewing this because both of you are not really into fantasy. I love it, but
No, my version of fantasy is when people break into song and dance in musicals. So this wasn't really my vibe. I'm gonna give it a 1 out of 5, and the 1 purely comes from seeing Yennefer as a young woman living with physical disability being seen as someone who can be powerful and sexual. So that is where the 1 comes from. The rest of it wasn't really a big fan of.
Yeah, I'm literally exactly the same, except I was a bit more harsh. So it was 0.5 out of 5 for me. You know, I like to go for like the half scores these days.
I mean, I've got to encourage anything that shows young women with physical disability as, fully able to be sexual beings.
It's like, do that, but just not in the way The Witcher did at all.
And don't erase it later.
Yeah, literally. It's not like take backsies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Catia, what did you give out of 5?
This is a difficult one. Can you give negative stars? No.
Well, yes, we have had that before.
Look, no. I agree with Steph about the 1 star going to that element of Yennefer's character. It's not the other stuff though is so significant that it kind of completely overwhelms. So if I was going to say, does this show harm or what's the impact of this show on disability in relation to disability representation? Is it more good or more harm? It's like way more harm, I think, and perhaps more to come with Gerald. But based on that, I will give it a 0.75 stars between you, Jason.
Oh my God, I introduced the 0.5s and now Katia's introduced the point. Yeah.
We're getting really creative with our scores now.
We're going to get like a 0.3 recurring or something.
No, I'm sure maybe to make it easier for representation in websites, etc. I'll give it a 1.
Okay. A very reluctant 1.
Very reluctant 1. And I have to say, whilst I'm not drawn to the genre, I certainly enjoyed aspects of the show, but it was, I mean, I couldn't really kind of get past that, in the end. But I think it's, and I think this is what's really problematic when really bad narratives are, packaged in really interesting, engaging, seductive type,
and high budget and popular.
Exactly. And that is, because people will be willing to overlook.
Exactly. Or it's just more impressionable, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's going to hit more people.
It is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for this week's episode. I want to say a massive thank you to Catia for joining us. We've absolutely loved having you and having you share your wisdom with us. And obviously, thank you as well to Steph. Thank you to everyone who has followed along with this episode as well. We really want to know what you think about The Witcher. It's a bit more beyond whether you just liked it or not. We need to know what you thought of the disability representation. Obviously, we have our strong views about it that we all kind of shared. But if you feel something different, if you noticed another character with disability or a different kind of perspective on the portrayals, please definitely let us know. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you literally just search ReFramed Podcast, we'll pop up. If that's not for you, you can also email us at hello@reframepodcast.com. Lastly, before we sign off, I also just want to say a huge thank you to the Community Broadcasting Foundation for helping to fund this series. And we will see you again next week. Thank you again. Bye.